Hello Revolution students, and welcome back to another video on the Chinese Revolution, area of study 1. In this video I'm going to look at the Japanese invasion and we're going to start with the occupation of Manchuria in 1931 by the Japanese, and then have a brief look at how the Japanese set up that Northern Autonomous Region, which pretty much they took over some of the provinces bordering Manchuria in China, and then we move on to the full-blown invasion by the Japanese of China, which began the Second Sino-Japanese War on the 7th of July 1937. So let's get into the key points. First one. So as I was talking about, the Japanese occupied Manchuria started the occupation on the 18th of September 1931. Occupation forces in Manchuria at the time, or soldiers, decided to blow up some railway tracks, and they used that as an excuse to occupy Manchuria fully. The consequences for both the GMD and the CCP were important. They contributed in some part to the GMD's eventual defeat by the CCP in 1949. So firstly, maybe one of the biggest, do we call it a mistake? I'm not sure, but we'll get, maybe not. Maybe Zhang Jieshi had no other options. But when the Japanese occupied Manchuria, Zhang wasn't only dealing with this Japanese occupation and potential invasion later on. He was also trying to defeat the CCP. So he had two enemies: the Japanese and the CCP, and there was actually even a third, his own warlord allies, who he couldn't totally trust. So he had three enemies. So he's trying to juggle all of these different opponents. And what he decided to do, because he was a good student of history, Chinese history, in his mind, the most potential threat to his authority wasn't the Japanese. He realized that he knew that China was a huge country, very, very difficult to conquer by a foreign enemy. However, throughout Chinese history, there had been more success by toppling the existing regimes, existing dynasties, Chinese dynasties, from within, when internal revolts had occurred. So if you look at if you look at Chinese history for the last 2,000 years, you can see the number of dynasties. Most of those dynasties were overthrown by internal enemies rather than external invaders. If we're thinking about external invaders, the Mongols, who set up the Yuan dynasty in the 13th and 14th centuries, and then obviously the Manchu, who invaded and established their own Qing dynasty in 1644. But apart from that, the vast majority of changes in dynasty in China had occurred as a result of internal rebellion, the collapse of an existing dynasty and being overthrown by internal foes. So Zhang Jieshi knew this, and he actually coined quite an interesting phrase relating to it. And we look at this point here. So Zhang Jieshi refused to resist the Japanese occupation. He did move some troops up to the border with Manchuria, but that was about it, to try to stop any further incursions by the Japanese. But his main focus at this time, from 1931 right up to 1934, was actually the communists. And we've looked at this at the Jiangxi Soviet and some of these other small Soviets that the communists had set up after the White Terror, and after they'd been forced out into the countryside by the Kuomintang from 1927 onwards, middle 1927 onwards. So, and the term he coined about prioritising, in his mind, the threat posed by the CCP compared to the Japanese was this one here, a very, very famous quote: "The Japanese are a disease of the skin, the communists are a disease of the heart." And what he is saying there is that the Japanese, all right, they're a disease of the skin, that's pretty bad, but the disease of the heart is a lot worse disease and can lead to death. And i.e., the communists are more of a threat to the, I suppose, China's body than a disease of the skin, which the Japanese were. There's another rendering or translation of this quote. It's rendered or translated as the Japanese are a disease of the skin, the communists are a disease of the soul, but it means the same thing. What Zhang Jieshi was saying there was that the communists were the greater threat than the Japanese. So he decided to focus most of his energies on defeating the communists. What that did, though, in the minds of the Chinese people, most Chinese saw or understood that the communists, yes, they were fighting the Kuomintang, but they were Chinese. All right, they may have had a different vision about what sort of China they wanted to create, but they were Chinese. The Japanese were not. Many Chinese, the average Chinese person in the street, Chinese intellectuals saw Zhang Jiexi's refusal to resist the Japanese occupation of Manchuria, just let the Japanese pretty much take it over and not fight them for it, as cowardly and as not standing up for China's, defending China against foreign imperialist enemies. And as a consequence, this contributed to a loss of popular support for the GMD and for Zhang Jieshi, and which contributed eventually to 1949, the defeat of the Kuomintang by the CCP. The next key point we get into, if we go back, so from September 1931 onwards, the Japanese occupied Manchuria, and then they slowly, in between the full-blown invasion there we can see in 1937 and the occupation of Manchuria in 1931, the Japanese actually extended their control south from Manchuria into the provinces bordering on Manchuria. I think there were about 5 of them, and they designated this region, this border region, these border provinces between Manchuria and China proper, as the Northern Autonomous Zone, and they pretty much controlled that area, so it helped them sort of gain even greater control in China. And this is actually, you can see here, this is what this, if we look at this image here, this political cartoon, that's what it's referring to here, this extension of, or creation of, the Northern Autonomous Region, where when the Japanese, are taking various northern provinces, and you can see here, this basket here reflects that. Those pieces of the dinosaur's tail are those northern provinces, and just in case you can't figure that out, the basket has been labelled northern provinces. China itself is, portrayed as a big sleeping dinosaur, a big sleeping giant, and it's waking up. And it's only waking up after a number of pieces of its tail have actually been cut off by this little Japanese soldier. And this is either an English or a political cartoon from the United States. So there's always a little bit hint of, I suppose, racism. And the Japanese are represented as small and feisty. China represented as the sleeping giant. And for those of you who are unaware, that alludes to the very famous quote by Napoleon about China, and he said something along the lines of that China was a sleeping giant, and when it awakes, it will, astound the world. Well, China in this image is just starting to wake up once the Japanese have taken these northern provinces. Getting back to moving on, anyway, getting back to the full-blown invasion, which occurred on the 7th of July 1937, the Marco Polo incident. That's when Chinese and Japanese troops pretty much had a shootout in Beiping, which then led to the full-scale invasion of China by the Japanese. They attacked in Beiping, and they also attacked places like Shanghai and so forth. A key consequence of this invasion was that it finally convinced Zhang Jieshi to create or form a second united front with the CCP, and they'd been negotiating this after the Xi'an incident, when Zhang Jieshi had flown up to Xi'an and tried to egg his troops on to attack Mao and his troops in the Yan'an Soviet. And when Zhang Jieshi had flown up to Xi'an, which was not far from the Yan'an Soviet, some of his own troops actually captured him and forced him to make an agreement with the CCP. I think it was in late December 1936, something like that. and Zhang Jieshi was only released by his troops when he promised to form a second united front against Japanese aggression and against the Japanese occupation of Manchuria and the creation of this northern autonomous zone or region. And he promised to make a second united front. He didn't really, it took him a long time to actually fulfill that promise. But when the Japanese invaded in July 1937, started their invasion, then on the 22nd of September 1937, Zhang Jieshi finally agreed to form a second united front with the CCP against the Japanese invaders. So at that point, the CCP allied with the Kuomintang, and they both were fighting the Japanese. In forming this second united front, they didn't forget that they were going to fight each other. Both Mao Zedong, Zhang Jieshi knew they were going to be fighting each other after the Japanese invaders were kicked out. So there was always on both sides, even when they were fighting the Japanese, both the CCP and the GMD always kept some of their troops back just in case they were going to have to fight against each other. This second united front actually lasted until about 1941, and then it collapsed when the GMD started attacking the CCP again, and vice versa. And when the United States entered the war after the Japanese decided to bomb Pearl Harbor in December 1941 and try to take the whole Pacific. Another key point about the Japanese invasion was that you can see there it contributed to poor morale and incompetent leadership of the Kuomintang. So particularly once the USA entered the war, Zhang Jieshi kept a lot of his troops behind, didn't engage as much as he could have with the Japanese invaders. Probably use a strategy of defence rather than offence to try to kick them out, because he was banking on the US to actually defeat the Japanese for him, and then he could actually divert or do what he really wanted to do, which was attack the CCP and get and Mao Zedong and get rid of the CCP out of China. He coined this strategy, which was trade space for time. So he decided, to use this strategy to retreat into the heartland of China as the Japanese advanced, and just slowly retreat so that the Japanese forces would be spread thin, that their lines of communication as well as supply would be stretched, and then they could be attacked and so forth more easily. But this trade space for time strategy, which he used from 1941, or even you could argue from late 37 onwards, it undermined, or his generals weren't happy about it. His troops weren't happy about it because they felt that they weren't attacking the Japanese as effectively as they should have been, or thinking on the flip side of it, not defending China as well as they could have against Japanese aggression. Another key point was that of the Second Sino-Japanese War was that it increased, you can see there, increased popular support for the CCP. So if we go back to the Long March, where it says here, as early as the Long March, Mao's and the CCP's avowed purpose was to fight the Japanese. Well, they were also running away from the Kuomintang, so they wouldn't get attacked or destroyed by the Kuomintang. But by marching north, when they started marching north to Yunnan, they inspired their troops, and they told the peasants and the areas and the people who they met along their long march, and as they marched north, that they're actually marching north to fight the Japanese, because the Kuomintang were not prepared to do that. They were marching north to kick the Japanese out of those northern autonomous region as well as Manchuria. And this increased popular support for the CCP. They were seen by the Chinese population as more patriotic, as defending China against a foreign aggressor, more patriotic than the GMD were. But that isn't the actual earliest time when the CCP declared war or avowed to fight the Japanese. Even at the Jiangxi Soviet, Mao Zedong had declared war on the Japanese when they occupied Manchuria. Not that really the CCP could do much to the Japanese up in Manchuria when they were down the Jiangxi Soviet, but was still seen as a patriotic act, and it still contributed to increasing their popular support. And then finally, you can see there the Japanese signed an unconditional surrender on the 14th of August 1945 after those two atomic bombs were dropped on Japan at Hiroshima and Nagasaki by the United States. So there you have the key points relating to the Japanese invasion of China and how it impacted upon both the GMD regime and how it increased CCP popular support within China. I have a key quote here which I just want to go through quickly. So, and it's from Philip Short, and it's from one of Chiang's generals, and it shows how dispirited they became as a consequence of Chiang's strategies, both this idea about the Japanese are the diseases are a disease of the skin and the communists are a disease of the heart, so focusing on the CCP rather than defending against the Japanese invaders in Manchuria, and also then when the war had started against the Japanese, his defensive strategy of trading space for time. So according to this general, our troops became soft and concerned only with pleasure. They lacked combat spirit and there was no willingness to sacrifice. So this, one of Zhang Jishi's generals was saying one of the reasons why they lost the Civil War and what happened as a consequence of their strategies in the Second Sino-Japanese War was that it actually undermined the fighting prowess of the Kuomintang troops. Okay, let's go on to a couple of historical interpretations. So the first one is by Michael Lynch, and from his work China from Empire to People's Republic. And Michael Lynch writes, Chiang's strategy against Japan derived from his belief that China was too large a country for the Japanese to occupy without exhausting themselves. A protracted war must end in Japan's defeat. He defined his approach as selling space to buy time. However, the policy of avoiding engagement with the invader proved uninspiring and brought obvious political dangers. His supporters frequently found it difficult to maintain their loyalty. So the fact that he wasn't standing up to the Japanese, as a consequence, his troops became disloyal and lost support for Zhang Jishe and his rule. Okay, his second historical interpretation, it's from Morris Meisner, Mao Zedong, a political and intellectual portrait. And he writes, during the brutal Japanese occupation, much of rural China became a political vacuum, and young peasant communist cadres came to fill it, organising peasants for patriotic resistance to the foreign invaders, promising agrarian reforms, so we're talking about land redistribution there, and making efforts to alleviate the economic hardships caused by the invasion and its brutalities. The result was the spectacular growth of communist power during the 8 years of Japanese occupation. So that's a key point from Meisner's historical interpretation here. He argues that the Sino-Japanese War, the occupation of China by Japan, or large parts of China by Japan from 1937 to 1945, led to the spectacular growth and support for the communist, the CCP, which then was a key factor in their eventual victory in 1949 over the GMD. In 1937, the Red Army numbered 70,000 primitively armed soldiers. In the summer of 1945, when the Japanese army surrendered, Mao's guerrilla forces had grown dramatically into a 1 million strong regular army, supported by peasant militias numbering several million part-time fighters. The membership of the CCP had increased to approximately 1,200,000 by 1945. By 1945, the communists effectively administered rural base areas with a population of almost 100 million people. So by 1945, the communists were governing a population larger than Australia's now, and those other figures just show you just how quickly, or how large, how and powerful the CCP became as a consequence of this Japanese invasion, as a consequence of the Japanese occupation of China, and as a consequence of Jiang Jishi's strategies, both to his earlier strategies to focus on the CCP rather than the Japanese occupation in Manchuria, and then his later strategy of trading space for time, which his own troops and his generals found very uninspiring, and not only them, but the Chinese population at large. So anyway, that is my video on the Japanese invasion of China. I hope you found it useful, and I will see you next time. Goodbye.